Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I thought I'd take you through some of my favourite whimsical fantasy books. So yeah, let's get into it. I think before we kind of get into the recommendations, I feel like it is my duty to tell you what I define as whimsical fantasy, because I know probably people have different ideas of what they think different genres are. So for me personally, whimsical fantasy is obviously a fantasy book that's quite light-hearted. I always associate whimsy and whimsical with fairies, not fae, not sexy fae mouse, but fairies, you know, wings, tails, the different kinds of fairy folklore fairies that you can get. So whimsical fantasy is kind of not too high fantasy, so rooted in the characters being fairies and them not living necessarily in what we count as the real world, human world, but it's not that dark. Obviously there probably are elements of darkness. Fairies can be quite tricky, or they like to play pranks, or they're probably you know, we are warned against the different things that fairies can do, make you dance until your feet bleed or whatever. But for me, whimsical is that kind of more light and lower level fantasy than perhaps something that's a 7-book series with really strong world building. So for my recommendations, all of them bar one have fairies in them. As I say, it's fairies, not fae, and I have done videos on this before, although I'm not against a fae male, but whimsical fantasy for me is the fairies, folklore fairies. So yeah, I'm excited to give you some of these recommendations. I hope you take some away. Start off strong with probably one of the more mainstream whimsical fantasy books, and that is The Cruel Prince. I've got a limited edition version, so it doesn't look like The Cruel Prince. That might be backwards because I'm ugly, so I have to flip my camera. So yeah, The Cruel Prince, if you haven't read this basically is about Jude. She's the main girl in it. Her mom was human, her dad was human. They've got an older sister who was half human, half fairy. And then the mom's ex-husband kind of still kills the mom and the dad and steals these 3 children away to fairy. And then it follows Jude and her journey about what it's like being human in the fairy realm. I'll leave it at that. There's a lot more to it than that, but just a quick synopsis. So Jude is our FMC, and then we have different types of fairies in this. So the Greenbrier line is the royalty, the fairy royalty in this book, and each Greenbrier heir has a different fairy characteristic. So Carden has a tail. Love me some Carden. So Carden has a tail. One of his other brothers, his name begins with B, but I can't think of what it is off the top of my head. He has thorns that stick out of his arms. Dane, that's another one. I think he has horns. So you can see what I mean when I say whimsical. They've got those very fairy elements. So The Cruel Prince by Holly Black, top tier whimsical fantasy. To be honest, any of her Folk of the Air books, so the trilogy is called Folk of the Air, so The Cruel Prince, The Wicked King and the Queen of Nothing, that's the trilogy. And then she did 2 more books after this trilogy called The Stolen Heir, I want to say, and it's in the same world but it's different characters. And then she had it's called The Modern Fairy Tales, and it's a collection of short stories or shorter stories with some of the characters that end up actually being in The Cruel Prince. So I think I've read 2 of the 3. I never got around to reading the 3rd one, but all of Holly Black's fairy books are what I would say top tier, chef's kiss whimsical fantasy. Dare I say she's the pioneer or leading writer, especially of the books that I read, for whimsical fantasy at the moment. So if you haven't read The Cruel Prince, I urge you to, or any of her other ones The Modern Fairy Tales or The Stolen Heir duology. So yeah, The Cruel Prince starting off strong. And a classic whimsical fantasy for me is the Wings series. So I literally think I read this series when I was 14, but I've got the audio books, so I do like to listen to them when I go to sleep. So essentially I like how Aprilynne Pike, that's the author, this is quite an old book. I would say this is quite an underrated whimsical fantasy. I don't really see people speaking about this ever, which I think is a real shame. It is very YA though, so you know, if you do pick this book up, read that in mind. It is YA. So is The Cruel Prince, to be honest. So perhaps whimsical fantasy is more of a YA genre, but really good series. Basically the main girl in this, Laurel, she is adopted by her parents. She just turned up on their doorstep one day and she is not quite human. She realises that there's something different about her, and then she ends up growing a flower on her back and realises that actually that means that she's a fairy. And what I like about this whimsical fantasy is that it takes what you would expect with fairies, so the flower on her back for example, but just makes it into something a bit different. So the flowers are meant to be like representative of wings. So in this book, the like premise of fairies is that they're actually plants, which I know sounds crazy and I don't think I'm quite selling it, but it's actually so cool how she like builds the fairies up in this. And there's a bit of a love triangle in this as well. Like, does Laurel want to be with her human boyfriend, or there's another fairy that she used to know when she lived in fairy as a child? Does she want to be with him? Like, it's really like, and there's like trolls, and it's even a bit Arthurian-y as well. Like, so like Arthurian legends, like that always links back to some kind of witchcraft in a lot of the books that I've read that are like Arthurian. But anyway, I'm like going off on a tangent. So yeah, Wings is such a good whimsical fantasy. I actually really think I'm going to go through some more recommendations, but if you take one recommendation away, I feel like the Wings series should be the one that you pick up first, because there's 4 books in this series. These books are quite short, they're quite small, the writing's massive, like you will literally fly through these, but it's just like a really different take on what fairies are in comparison to some of the other books, like fairy books that are out there. So really cool. Love triangle, different take on fairies. Who does she end up with? Like, what world does she end up staying in? The human world, the fairy world. It's actually just so good. Yeah, so Wings is another whimsical fantasy recommendation. And then moving on to Wings of Starlight. So this is a singular book and it's based on like the Disney fairy movie. So I did a short on this, which probably sums it up a bit better, but essentially this is like based on it's like the prequel to one of the Tinkerbell films. So I will say, even though I say that whimsical fantasy is like light and airy, the end of this book left me staring at the wall. But thankfully, because I then did my research and found out that there is a Tinkerbell film that kind of like is the events after this book. Obviously I had to go and watch the Tinkerbell film straight away, and then it kind of left me feeling more satisfied. So yeah, the book is about Clarion, who's heir to Pixie Hollow, so she's going to be the queen of the fairies eventually, and then disaster strikes and she ends up like forming an unlikely friendship with Millery, who's a winter fairy. And in these books, winter fairies are not allowed to cross into or associate with any of the other fairies, because if you're winter, you can't survive in any of the warm countries, seasons. If you're a warm season fairy, you can't survive in winter. So already we're getting elements of forbidden romance, which I love. Their fairies, I think, is more whimsical than a Disney Tinkerbell kind of rewrite. So this screams whimsy, and yeah, it's actually just so good. Like, I love when books use like seasons. I think like using seasons as like a court system or like as drivers of plot, I think is quite cool. So like there's like obviously the 4 seasons, and fairies will belong to each season, so spring, summer, winter and autumn. I think that's quite whimsy too. Also, Millery is literally like a YA, gentler, less rugged version of Rowan Whitethorn. He's got long silver hair and he pulls back half of it, and if that's not enough of an excuse to read this book, then it is a whimsical fantasy with forbidden romance and intrigue and slow burn and magical powers. Those are just all the reasons that you should read it. So yeah, another whimsical fantasy recommendation is Wings of Starlight. And then I don't have this one with me because it's at my sister's, Story of My Life, but An Enchantment of Ravens is also like a whimsical fantasy book. I actually say this is quite comparable to The Cruel Prince, just in the sense that sometimes The Cruel Prince probably doesn't feel as whimsy as some of the other recommendations that I've given you. So if you've read The Cruel Prince anyway, you'll know that, like, you'll know. But yeah, Rook or Rook, I can't quite remember, I think it's Rook. I also haven't read this book in ages, but he's like fairy, and then the main girl in it isn't a fairy, and she's a painter, but her painting I think brings things to life. So she ends up getting taken to the fairy world, and then they have to go through like the different parts of fairy in this world to fix whatever problem has arisen. And what I like about An Enchantment of Ravens, and what I think makes it really whimsy, is the air of mystery that surrounds the whole book. So one of the classic fairy folklore riddles or facts is that like you will never know the real name of a fairy. Like that's like folklore and tradition. You can't know a fairy's real name, because if you know their real name you've got power over them. So like we go for the whole book thinking, what's his real name, like what's his real name? Then he whispers it into her ear at the end of the book, and we aren't privy to whatever the whisper is. So the whole book is just coated in mystery for the whole time. And I think An Enchantment of Ravens, whilst I can't quite remember the entire story, so I haven't really summed it up that well, but what I can remember, I think the way it plays on fairy folklore and tradition is what makes it quite whimsical. It really just uses classic fairy superstition in the same way that The Cruel Prince does, so that like turning your clothes inside out or wearing rowan berries so that you can't be ensorcelled. It plays on those kind of things, which is why I have included it in this, because I do think it's quite comparable to The Cruel Prince. So in Enchantment of Ravens, I have done an awful view of summing it up, but it's because I've not read it in years. But I do want to read it now, so I'm going to put that back on my TBR to read. But again, it's that whole I think what makes it whimsical is the element of mystery to it. So yeah, go and check out the synopsis or blurb of An Enchantment of Ravens, because I've done an absolutely awful job of summarising it for you, but I do think that's worth recommended in the whimsical fantasy. The last book in my whimsical fantasy recommendations is Once Upon a Broken Heart. So I've saved this one for last because it doesn't actually have fairies in, so I kind of like have grouped them into the two. But yes, I know that this isn't the first book, but when me and my sister split the books, we had the first one as a paperback and then the other two, because it's a trilogy, as hardback. So I've kept the hardbacks and then she's got the paperback, so we're like slowly building up the paperback collection and the hardback collection. So I still need to buy the hardback of Once Upon a Broken Heart, which is why I'm holding up the second book. But yeah, Once Upon a Broken Heart is whimsical fantasy without the fairies, but it's definitely whimsical fantasy because it's literally a fairy tale. I just think the fairy tale element of this really makes it whimsical. Like it's what I would count as whimsical, because like their world is split into two. I think it's like the south and the north, and as soon as Aprilynne goes north, you literally feel like the whimsy of the magic and just all the different characters there. So basically follows Aprilynne, who wants to, she basically gets left at the altar, and she wants her fiance to fall back in love with her. So she goes and asks the Prince of Hearts for him to help her with her love life, and then he helps her, but not in the way you would expect. And then she moves to the north, where all the fairy tales are and where all the fairy tale creatures are, to kind of go on a journey to the north, and I'll leave it at that. But I just love all the fantasy whimsy in Once Upon a Broken Heart, because it really does play on like a fairy tale. Like it's as though you're a kid again reading like about Cinderella. Like I really do love it, but with the elements of like forbidden romance, like a dark morally grey MMC. So like it's not like you're a child reading a child's book, like you are an adult or a young adult. As I said, I think all of these recommendations I would say are like young adult books, but who doesn't love a young adult book? The tension of young adult books, in my opinion, are sometimes better than reading a spicy romance. Just saying. So yeah, really whimsical, nostalgic for the fairy tales we would read as children. Aprilynne has pink hair, and like that's a sign of like magical power from the north. So like all the elements, all the magical elements in Once Upon a Broken Heart, I do think are quite whimsical. There are like vampires in it, which I think doesn't quite meet the whimsy, but we'll just ignore that fact. And then even like the Prince of Hearts, or Jax, he eats apples, but we don't know why he eats the apples. And again, there's that element of mystery, so I think with whimsical fantasy, kind of the mystery and the what isn't said is what makes it whimsical as well. So my last recommendation is Once Upon a Broken Heart. Yeah, I've kind of just flown through some of those recommendations and I've kept it quite brief because I want you to go on the whimsy of not really knowing what they're about and just enjoy that element of mystery, which I think fairies are like that anyway, because they're like outside of our realm and they're just like so set apart from us. So yeah, I hope you have enjoyed this little video. Hope you've been able to take some whimsical fantasy recommendations away, and let me know in the comments which book you're gonna take away and add to your TBR, and also let me know if I've missed out any glaringly obvious ones. So I was trying to wrap my brain thinking what whimsical recommendations can I give, but I feel like I definitely don't read enough whimsical fantasy, so help a girl out. If you have got any whimsical fantasy recommendations, then please let me know what they are in the comments.